Welcome to the Circular Cities panel.
I'm Christian Krober.
And we are so excited to welcome 5 amazing panelists here today. So I'd like to start off by introducing, we're going to take turns introducing all of the panelists, and then we're going to jump right into discussion. We also would like to welcome all of our participants here listening in. So first I'll start off introducing Mr. Peter Warren. He's the co-founder of the Circular Collective, an open source knowledge platform that facilitates, activates, and enables discussion on circular economy in India. He's previously worked at UNDP India as a resource mobilization and partnership lead on SDGs specifically. He's a TEDx speaker, German Chancellor Fellow, and Alexander von Humboldt Fellow as well.
I would like to welcome Oriana Romano, who just has to turn on her camera, then she's joining us as well. She leads the OECD's program on the circular economy in cities and regions, and for this spearheaded its most recent report, the 2020 report on circular economy. And for this, she also organizes the OECD Roundtable, involving a diverse set of stakeholders from public, private, and NGOs.
Great. Then we have Jasmine Mia, the Officer for Governance and Social Innovation at the European Secretariat of ICLI, the Local Governments for Sustainability, a local network of cities dedicated to sustainable development. She has a background in urbanization and political activism, and she's specifically working on multiple Horizon 2020 projects, representing ICLI throughout German organizations and institutions. Here, she's focusing on sustainable mobility and assessment.
We're also joined by George Hugman. He's a representative of Circular Berlin, and there he's active in the built environment team. Hugman has organized workshops yesterday and today. And besides that, he's also a doctoral researcher at the Technical University here in Berlin, focusing on the nexus between climate change and urban development.
And last but not least, we have Fedra Van Huyse, a PhD and head of societal transition and senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environmental Institute. Her research focuses on cities, sustainable consumption, circular economy and finance, both within Europe and in developing countries. She's particularly interested in social justice and transition processes, incorporating all diverse stakeholders in our society.
So there's a lot of themes we want to get to today. We have a great panel assembled, and we want to discuss how we can assess circular cities, how circular cities are planned, how the community can be involved, and also how we can take account and address differences across the globe. So there's obviously a large set of interdisciplinary, interconnected topics. So we want to address all these topics, but obviously we're going to see where the conversation is going. And we very much want to invite our participants to participate and see, just jump in if you have interesting insights to share. Regarding the Q&A, obviously we want to involve our viewers as well. You can drop questions in the Q&A tab, in the sessions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. You can write questions there, but we also have 20 minutes dedicated to the Q&A at the end of our panel. So feel free with our participants to ask your questions live to them. So to start off, we want to have a more general conceptual question, and that is, what does a circular city look like to you? Maybe, jump in if you have an answer for this. So what does a circular city mean to you? Anyone? Can you unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here today. Fedra, thanks for the introduction. I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute, and so we carry out research on all sorts of sustainability questions. And so with regards to your question, what is a circular city to me? I know it's a very hot topic. There's lots of cities that have said they want to be circular. There's lots of policy instruments and tools that cities can apply to be circular. And so I would say, in my opinion, there is not yet a homogeneous or consistent understanding of what it means to be a circular city. I think it's a concept that has been taken up recently by quite a few cities. Within Europe, it used to be quite active and it still is. Quite a lot of cities in China are working on circular economy. But I would say so far, in my opinion, the circular cities look mostly as cities that do something on closing the loop when it comes to recycling and recovering of waste materials. but I would say that definition is a bit too narrow. And so I would advocate for cities to go wider than focus just on waste and construction, mostly, to something that encompasses more sectors, different consequences on people, on environment, and on society as a whole. Thanks.
Yeah, I actually think specifically because it's not a homogenous concept. When you say circular cities, different people think of different transitions or different policy implications to that. Kind of adding on to that initial question, why, to narrow it down a little bit, why is it important to focus on circular policies at the city level rather than on larger national levels or regional levels? I know, Jasmine, specifically your work on ICLI has focused on translating SDGs and the circularity concept to specific city level, local level implementation, if you could add on a bit.
Yes, great, thank you. I want to raise my hand anyway, so perfect. Just a clarification, everything you said was correct, but we just pronounced it, it's just ECLAI. So yeah. All right, thank you so much for having me here. I agree with what you said, Fedra, that often definitions are too narrow and we need to look at it in a broader context. And it's also what we do. So, you know, we don't just like think of one aspect, but circular city, circular economy, you know, it almost affects all fields that we have in cities. And cities are so instrumental because, you know, most of us live in cities. It's getting, you know, let's see what effect COVID has, but technically, you know, urbanization is moving forward. Most of the waste, most of the energy, most of the greenhouse gas emissions, all of that comes from cities. So that's where we need to make the changes. That's and cities, you know, they're sort of incubators, and you know, all creative people live there, lots of companies, and so that's if we can make it happen there. Yeah, we can't make it happen anywhere. That sounds very much like Frank Sinatra, but you know, it's we need to make these changes in cities, and cities are best equipped to do so. So that's why it's so important to do it. And just one more thing. So there are not that many definitions for circular cities as for circular economy in general, but there are some. And we've also created some at ECLAI. I'm not going to read them out, but one of them, for example, we have for our circular cities declaration that we launched last year. And it looks at a lot of different fields, and it also focuses on human well-being, because that's the point. That's where we have circular cities. How do we make these cities for the people? How does circular economy benefit people? In particular, also with a focus on justice, you know, so we can't leave anyone behind in that regard either.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this up. We actually want to talk about how to include cities across the globe more widely later on. Maybe Georg, maybe Piyush, do you have something to share what a circular city means to you and why to focus on the city level rather than the state level?
Yeah, if I may start. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm, as you said, researcher at TU Berlin, but I'm also in the Built Environment group of Circular Berlin. And I think this is how words come together. So one is more the technical word, because I'm in the field of urban planning and urban studies. So there we really look a lot resource and material flows, for example, and I think specifically in regards to circularity on energy, water, materials, food, and waste, of course. But I think that's not the whole story. And as already introduced, and I think put it very clearly, I think, and that is maybe what Circular Berlin is trying to represent, it's also about the society at large. And I very much like the concept of circular society, which enlarges the circular economy concept through different factors such as time, behavior change, etc. Maybe we can talk about this later in a bit more detail. But I would also advocate for a definition that goes beyond the technical sphere and also includes very much the societal sphere.
So I could just quickly pitch in. See, I think there is no definition of circular cities because we also do not city is, you know. So if you just Google what is city, or if you go to a definition of a city, it just means an inhabitant where people sort of gather. Currently, the cities are really growing vertically and horizontally. If you see in a city that you are, even Berlin, which has outgrown itself, you know, like in the past 50 years or so, even the greater Berlin and cities like Cottbus and small towns are also being sort of taken up by Berlin or the greater Berlin area. So it's so difficult to even set boundaries for a city, even like Berlin. Where I come from, New Delhi, if we have one of these fast trains where, you know, like commute could be possible to 200, 300 kilometers in 1 hour, then where do you sort of stop defining it? As we currently speak, China is gearing up for cities which are more than 100 million people. Can you imagine the entire population of Germany being in one city in China? We, at least in Delhi, we already have 25 million people, which is almost 1/4 the population of Germany, and using pretty much more resources than Germany itself. So, you know, like, I think there would not be really a definition to really guide us stating that this is a circular city, because we don't really have any geographical boundaries. And even for people as well, because of daily commute and daily routine where people are migrating on everyday basis and going out, especially if you are not able to afford, or if you have a better lifestyle outside that city. In fact, what we have currently is more like a vision, you know, like a broad vision. So what Fedra was also saying earlier, there is this, you know, like you would say 20, 30 cities like Peterborough, even circle of Berlin, or, you know, like they have like a vision, what they want to achieve, which aligns to pretty much what Jasmine is also saying, which could be an SDG, you know, like in next 10 years as well. So I would say, you know, like it's not fair to sort of segregate it into this is a circular city and this is a smart city and this is an SDG city or a millennium city. So it all needs to, I think the vision are pretty much the same, which needs to, you know, like what George was also mentioning, that it needs to cater to the society, to the environment, to the species we are surrounded by.
Great. And if Oriana, you also want to jump in on just what a circular city means specifically to you, that'd be great.
You're muted, Oriana.
All right, we seem to be having some tech problems. Oriana, I think if you
our tech team is gonna reach out to you. It's gonna text you in the chat, so they will figure it out. But actually, maybe let's move on to the next topic. Piyush already mentioned it, like how this very holistic and broad definition of circularity, that we really shouldn't restrict ourselves. Fedra, I think, also mentioned that we shouldn't just look at waste disposal and construction, to really have a holistic approach there. But yeah, actually, maybe that connects quite well to our first subtopic, looking at assessments. So what like a circular city actually is. So maybe as a broad question, how can we identify a city that city is doing like well on circularity? What are best practices for a circular city? Anyone who'd like to start?
Well, I think there's two parts to the question. So first of all, it's, well, how do you assess the circularity at a city level? And secondly, what's the best practice for a city, building on the assessment? So I think it would be fair to say that so far there's not yet an assessment framework that has been applied consistently across these different cities. People often talk about the donut economy model, which is being applied in Amsterdam right now. There's frameworks developed by Circle City, by Metabolic, and so on and so forth, and they're quite popular at the moment. I should say we have a project funded by Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency, on exactly that, developing a framework that allows you to measure the circularity in the city level from a quantitative perspective. Because a lot of the frameworks that exist at the moment, they are either very qualitative, they're based on different workshops and stakeholder assessments and so on, but they do not, or you then have the very quantitative one, which are material flow analysis based on LCA, urban metabolism, and so on. But I would say there's nothing yet that combines that qualitative with the more quantitative, looking across different sectors, across different setups as well, like Piyush was saying. And here also about like moving to a society instead of a city, because I think one of the important things to do is to scope and to set your boundaries. What city do we look at? City of New Delhi? Do we pick the whole geographical area, or do we focus on just a region or a neighborhood or a sub part? So I would say first big challenges in terms of the assessment frameworks. There's not yet one that has been applied in many cities. So we cannot really say how you can assess a circular city. But then I think in terms of best practice, we actually just came out also under this Vinova project. We are doing a review of circular city strategies and articles. We just read 151 articles. We hope that is a nice set of academic and grey literature on circular cities. And so we're trying to map a little bit who does what, which cities, what strategies, what things do they mention? Is it governance frameworks? Is it jobs? Do they talk about finance and so on? And so I would say the best examples or best practices are the ones where you have multiple stakeholders involved in the development of a strategy. So you can bring in that multi-sector perspective, but also look at the different parts of what the city should be doing. Ultimately, the plan is we all want to live in places that are good for people, where people can thrive, so where we have jobs, where we have parks, where we can have good family lives, and so on and so forth. So for that, I would say best practice is for a city in the strategy to bring on board as many stakeholders as they can. So this would be civil society, private sector, and so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you, Fedra, for talking a little bit about the developing assessment tool that SEI is working on. I also wanted to ask Oriana specifically if you could talk a little bit about the OECD scorecard. I know that has been in development and as a means of assessing what circularity is in the city.
So I hope it works now. Can you hear me? Yes, good. So thank you very much for having me, first of all, and sorry about the technical issues. Let me just briefly reflect on the first question, which is linked to the second. It will take literally 1 minute just to say that I would emphasize really the importance of applying circular economy in cities, and the work that we are carrying out in OECD within the program on circular economy in cities and regions really aims at supporting this transition from a linear to a circular economy, because cities are really the places where people live, where people work, where people consume and produce. So if we think about the fact that 55% of the population will be living in cities by 2050, that cities consume 2/3 of energy, that produces 70% of greenhouse gases emission, 80% of food is consumed in cities. So it is really needed to find and to apply a system thinking like the one that the circular economy is trying to apply in cities in order to manage resources in an efficient way and to avoid that anything is just wasted, but that can represent a resource instead. So in terms of the definition, it's true, and I agree with my colleagues that there is not just one definition for the circular economy, but the OECD within this program and through the work that we have done, we identify at least 3 main dimensions for the circular economy that implies a systemic shift in cities. One, it is related to services, from water to waste to energy, which have to be provided in a way to make efficient use of natural resources and primary material. And we know the cities have competencies over waste management, water management, energy, and so on. The second is to look at the economic activities that take place in cities in a way that can close loops, or at least narrowing or slowing the loops, making sure that we use materials as long as possible And the third is about infrastructure, because we need to make sure that the cities, infrastructure in cities, avoid linear lock-in. So they construct and plan infrastructure in a way that are disconnected from one another. Water, waste, energy, just to say a few sectors which are key for the circular economy should. Then cities have an important role to play when it comes to building infrastructure. Now, how to measure all this? Well, this is a very difficult task. In the latest report we published in 2020, we inventoried more than 400 indicators from more than 30 strategies on the circular economy at national, regional, and local level. And basically, we found out that these indicators are data-driven rather than objective-driven, meaning that most of the indicators are related to waste management. But again, the circular economy is not about waste. So we need to find a way to really measure progress from an economic, social, and governance point of view. In order to provide countries, cities, and regions, because the OECD, as you know, is an intergovernmental organization working with governments, we developed an OECD scoreboard on the governance of the circular economy, which is composed of 12 governance dimensions to identify the level of progress of cities in applying these governance dimensions to make sure that cities that want to move towards a circular economy have the right regulatory, financial, capacity building, or green public procurement, all these conditions ensure that the transition is actually possible. I'll stop here, but I'm happy to keep going on the description on what we do.
Jasmine, go ahead. Thank you so much, Elena.
I just wanted to add one more thing on the assessment, because I think it also goes in line with what Fedra and Oriana just said. I think it makes sense that there is no assessment tool that we can all go to, because as we all said in the beginning, there is no common definition. So what are we supposed to assess if we don't agree what a circular city is? And, we've also had some pilots like, oh, this is how we could assess it, but nothing's really taken off yet. And yeah, we've also developed frameworks. Right now there's a new ECLAI framework, but sometimes it seems like, oh, how many R's can you come up with, right? It used to be 3 R's, now it's like 5 or 7. And I think the most important thing is that a city picks what works for them and then does it, because yeah, that's the most important thing. We prefer, if they use our framework, but if they use something else, that's more important that they do anything in the first place.
If I can come in here, I like just you said, it's important that the city does it. And I kind of think that is a little bit one of the barriers for the cities, or one of the things. They might be too hesitant to do anything because they don't know the ultimate impact of it. So I would also agree with because it's also my predisposition for action. Like, I think we are in the decade of action, so we can debate around definitions and different frameworks and indicators and how do you measure. But more importantly, let's do something about it, and I think, so that said, it's important for cities while they implement their strategies to build in moments where they stop and evaluate, and then they say, okay, we will run with something now for like 6 months or a year, and then we will reassess if it doesn't work, let's change trajectory. But that they just do something, because we could be waiting for a while before we have a definition of what a circular city is.
I absolutely agree.
To start making that transition. I wanted to specifically ask Piyush, as the largest circular economy platform in India, we've talked about the importance of people, about leaving no one behind in circular economy
transition. So specifically with the Circular Collective, what stakeholders are you engaging with? How and why specifically those groups of people?
So at the collective, a natural progression of the work, as I did in Germany and in UK as a German Chancellor Fellow and as a Humboldt Fellow. So after I came back to India, I figured, of course, that there is not a lot of clarity on the topic of circular economy. It was being termed as more or less a new way of recycling or waste management, and to sort of declutter that noise around recycling, we started this platform. Essentially, it's a volunteer-run platform. And what we have now is a lot of youth and students, and especially university and school students, who are really interested and passionate about learning circular economy. So this is sort of our main context. So we speak at many platforms and many universities, and we have a bunch of students from schools as well, where we, like, conduct all these master classes and introductory courses on circular economy. And what does that mean? Essentially, it is their future, like years they would have to grapple with, and they would have to sort of redesign the products that we are currently consuming. So that was the main idea also of, like, really getting along the youth, essentially from urban planning and engineering. And what we see is also very interesting. Currently, a lot of culture and art students are interested. So we documenting a lot of case studies which are from centuries ago, and like from 18th century, 19th century, which was all around circularity. Of course, terminologies, it's always, like, of course, you come across discussions around, in our grandparents' age, everything was circular, so why are we sort of making any progression? So we are sort of also trying to declutter that and document case studies, because for a country like India, it's all around grassroots innovations. And of course, we can talk a lot about circular cities, but for us, the most important bit is still the grassroots and the rural areas, and that is where, like, all these interventions are also needed.
Awesome. Much. Oh, Ariane, come in.
Thanks. I just would like to intervene because I think that what Piyush just, for three reasons. So the way we conceive the circular economy in these studies or in the program at the OECD that we are running, people, policies, and places. So the people, as Piyush was saying, it's very important because the circular economy is a shared responsibility. It's not just about what the governments can do from a top-down approach, even though establishing a vision is definitely key. Of actions, I agree with Fedra, lots of actions in place, but if they are too fragmented, they won't necessarily lead to the expected objectives. So it is important to have a vision, but in a shared responsibility. Government, business, non-for-profit organization, citizens, they all have a role to play when it comes to consumption patterns and to close loops. The second is about policies, because we said that yes, waste is important within the circular economy, but water is important, energy is important, building and construction, food, everything that's happening in cities. And so it's important to close loops in a way that an output for some is an input for somebody else. And increasing this systemic approach is fundamental. And I agree, there is a third places. Cities are not isolated like ecosystem. We have to understand that input and output of materials, flows, and energy come across the cities and within the rural areas, surrounding areas. When it comes to food, it's not just about producing and consuming food in cities, it's about producing food somewhere, distributing food. So the circular economy, beyond the single project, system thinking. And so thinking systemically also across the places, so urban and rural areas, is absolutely key to make sure that this is a transition that can happen.
So much. Actually, I'm not sure if everyone here had a chance to attend the keynote that just happened prior to the panel with the Berlin Secretary for the Environment, Stefan. He actually talked a lot about procurement and actually how to engage as many stakeholders as possible. Georg, can you maybe jump in and talk about your work in the built environment team at Circular Berlin?
Yes, there's reactions I would like to make to the comments of everyone before. But maybe I try to focus it on Berlin and yeah, maybe first of all say what we do in the Circular Berlin environment, in the built environment group. currently we have a focus on 3 things, I would say. One is, that is what Circular Berlin as a grassroots bottom-up organization is doing anyway, bringing together stakeholders and kind of map the ecosystem. And we also started actually to map material flows for some certain kinds of industries. So really trying to understand, okay, what is the stakeholder power, what are the interests, and bringing those together through different formats. The second is we are currently organizing an exhibition that has a focus on reusing construction materials, and we bring together a wide range of best practices and also focus on Berlin and beyond. So the second aim of our work is really to go public and to create awareness and try to do this, in that case, via an exhibition. And the third thing is that we actively try to offer educational formats, as for example the summer school that I'm going to be running this summer, and there's also other things in the pipeline that we are currently trying to produce. So really trying to create awareness also on a kind of educational level for the topic. So circular construction, yes, maybe one thing that is very important from Oriana that we also try to work with, so both at TU Berlin and also at Circular Berlin, is a systemic approach. And I think this is really, really key here. And that has also touches on the points of how do you measure circularity, what are the boundaries. And here basically what I can say, and I know the literature all around urban metabolism, for example, it's very, very hard to quantify it on a city level, okay? And that might also have then consequences for policymaking, that maybe quantifying all the material flows of a city is almost impossible because there's so much dynamic in those flows. And they also depend on different seasons, and it's very, very hard to have a good assessment from that perspective. And second, since I'm an urban planner, urban designer, I also want to emphasize the urban-rural focus. And I think this is really where this systemic approach comes in, because what we are doing in a project this semester is to focus on value chains. So we don't only focus on the city itself, although maybe the product might be consumed in the city, but we try to focus on entire value chains. In this case, it is on construction and basically the value chain, as we call it, wood to city. So how does the tree literally come to the city and becomes architecture? And we try to assess this for Berlin and Brandenburg, so that's the wider region of Berlin. And what kind of stakeholders are involved, what kind of commodity flows are organized there, what kind of regulations do we have, who is participating, what does it need to infrastructure purpose, like what kind of infrastructure do you need to make this happen, and of course, what are the final products and how are those pushed, for example, by the city of Berlin? And that's, I think, one part that we have heard from Stefan Tido that I think works pretty well in Berlin. They really try to push wood in construction, which we or I would also consider as a very circular process. And this is something that we are looking at very specifically. So my final comment here, and maybe to focus on the city of Berlin, is that what I'm still missing a little bit. So I think there is some good initiatives, and what also we have seen from Circular Berlin, out of this perspective, there is a lot of zero waste focus and a lot of repair and reuse focus. And this is okay. This is very much focused on the consumption level. But I think the shift that is occurring or should be occurring is to also take into consideration production, and specifically where this production comes from, and whether it's a global supply chain or how maybe local supply chains can be emphasized. And that then it's much easier, because those are much easier to control, and those are then also much easier to use all the byproducts that might occur. So we are trying to come close to something of a circular economy.
Great. Thank you for those insights specifically about Berlin. I was wondering if we could get a little bit more specific from the rest of our panelists as well in terms of specific policies for procurement. Procurement has kind of been the buzzword of what municipal governments can do. What does that mean in terms of, if I was a politician in the city, what would you look for? What would you suggest for policymakers looking to transition their procurement practices? I know Fedra's worked on this a little bit as well.
Yes, I have. Thanks, Ali. So we just published a blog on the circular procurement. So as Stefan said, Berlin is purchasing 4 to 5 billion euro, the city, a year. Here in Sweden, the amount is about 79 billion euro across all the Swedish cities. So the potential for them to influence the market is really high, quite substantial. But so what are now the challenges for circular procurement at a city level? So first of all, it's to understand what it is that you're buying. If you think about city governments and all the functions that they carry out, they have schools, they have healthcare responsibilities, they do roads, they do parks, they do also internal democracy and fiscal follow-up. So across all these different functions, they need to amalgamate all the needs, and we're talking easy needs like pens and paper, but also furniture, insulation materials, windows, new constructions. So the first challenge for a city is, what are we buying? And then the second question would be, or the second challenge would be, so how can we buy differently? So understanding the markets and knowing different types of products, services, moving from an ownership basis to a lease basis or a service basis system. And well, the market moves really quickly. I would say the private sector sees an opportunity, they develop something, they launch it quickly. First, well, local officers in city governments, with all the responsibilities that they have and all the tasks that they have to do, it is an additional responsibility and task to follow up the market. And I would say that's really not feasible for local authorities to have that knowledge at hand all the time. I think another one challenge for city governments is that they are funded with taxpayers' money. So ultimately it comes down to the financial bottom line. They cannot procure the most expensive item on the market because it would just not be good value for money. So that said, given these three challenges, I would say the best thing local authorities can do is find ways to work together with the private sector. And there's some cities in Finland. I listened to someone from the city of Turku in Finland who have developed new ways of procuring instead of writing the tender already themselves and then going to the markets, working with the markets to come up with the specifications of what they need to buy. And so basically switch the procurement process around a little bit. I would say second thing that could be done is to make it mandatory to integrate circular economy indicators in the procurement process or in the tender evaluations, like it is with fair trade, for example. I know that's the case in Belgium, and I think even in the Netherlands, that city governments can request for products to be labeled. So that would be another good thing that cities could do. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Piyush, Jasmine, do you have something to add on this? Otherwise, yes, Jasmine, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, I'd like to add one thing. I'm not from our procurement team, so I'd like to keep it short, but I agree that it should just be something that city administrations integrate into their everyday work. Like, it should always be a standard. Look at sustainable procurement, and with procurement in particular, it's, this is nothing where you need your citizens or so to also be active. If it comes to procurement, it's your decision, and it's very easy to implement easy to implement. So I think it's very important that we do this, and we actually have a lot of resources on how city administrations can do this, from like the general procurement to a more specialized policy papers and so on, like ICT or events or whatever. So we have a lot of resources that, you know, administrations could use if they wanted to. And I just want to comment on one thing that Georg said, which was the value chain. I think it's absolutely important that we look at the entire life cycle of a product, because we know that, you know, if you don't, you have a very nice way of calculating your emissions and making them look good. So I think we all agree that, yeah, that's a very key point.
Oriana, I saw your hand earlier. Actually, maybe if you want to also elaborate on your work in I saw your unit at the OECD is also responsible for water governance. Maybe you could specifically elaborate also on that as part of your answer.
Yes, on the public procurement, I think it's definitely an important point, and one of the major tools that cities can use to move towards a more circular economy approach. Which just in terms of numbers, I think is worthy to highlight that public procurement for 12% of GDP and 1/3 of public expenditure in OECD countries. So if we look at Europe only, it means that every year 250,000 public authorities spend around 40% of, which means 2 trillion euro per year. So it's quite big, and this way of procuring, so making choices in relation to the market for public services or the products that are in relation, for example, to infrastructure, to building, to food, to catering, can really make a change. And there are already some very good initiatives all around the OECD. We collected information from 50 cities in OECD countries, and some of the cities are including circular economy principle in construction tenders to increase the introduction of recycled materials in new construction, or the traceability of disposal waste. And this is the case of Amsterdam in the Netherlands and Paris in France. For example, Ljubljana in Slovenia, they foster product as a service by renting printers, electric lamps, or furniture instead of buying them. And in Japan, in Kitakishu, you have public procurement used to promote the in-use phase of clothes and uniform. So how to reduce to buy new one and reuse what is already available. There are lots of issues in relation to how to make this not just an exception, but business as usual. Also back to the problem of measurability, because as long as is the most important, the basic criteria to decide on how to use public money, because there is no such a way to measure the impact that are mostly from an environmental impact or in relation to efficient material management, then it is difficult to just money will be used. So again, measuring and using a life cycle analysis, for example, can help, but there is a lot to improve. And one way that the cities can do to make sure that the market is also ready to improve circularities in production is to be a launching customer. Because the problem is that many times there are only big companies that can respond to public procurement calls. Instead, there are many enterprises that would do the same job, but actually they don't have the same capacities in terms of human, technical, and financial resources. So if the city could be the customer and open up, for example, for challenges and make market analysis before launching the public procurement call, then this would be also a first step. In relation to water, the managing two programs, one on the circular economy and one on the circular economy within the same unit at the OECD, is to provide support to countries in relation to governance of resources use. And indeed, water sectors circular by nature per se is from a sectors that applying circular economy principles for very long, and there is much more to do in addition to water reuse, of changing wastewater treatment plants into biofactory that are related to the urban factory as well. For example, we are working of Granada in Spain, and indeed one of the entry point to think about how to apply circular economy principles in the city in a systemic and a holistic way started from the water sector. So they have a wastewater treatment plant that was transformed into a biofactory in order for this factory to be 100% self-sufficient in terms of energy and actually being from consumer of energy to producer of energy for the cities, how to reuse water, how to produce material, and this has to be connected with all the sectors in that have an economic value. For example, in the case of Granada, is the culture sector, is the tourism sector, is related to waste that is consumed and it is produced. Amplify, let's say, this approach is again needed to look at how policies interact with another, water and agriculture, water and construction, water and energy to recovery, for example, sludge from sewage treatment or use organic fertilizer or for construction material, but also again to look at the interaction across places in relation to bioeconomy, agriculture, and organic residues between the urban and rural areas. These kind of linkages are important to be defined.
Maybe as a last point on procurement and urban planning, Dirk, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to just throw another quick statement here, and maybe also it's good because to talk about examples and the example of the city of Berlin, maybe that helps illustrate things. Thank you, Oriana, for all the numbers regarding procurement. I think that shows that it's a big stepping stone towards circularity. And thank you also about your examples with the water. That's I find that quite interesting. Water in the south of Spain. I want to say that public procurement in Berlin is sold as a success story, and I think it really is. And you need to know a bit of background why that is. So Berlin has two levels of governance. One is the city, and one are the district level policies. So that means there's often very much a conflict between those two levels, and even between the different Senate departments. So, for example, between the economic department and the urban planning department. So there's a lot of potential for conflict, but this public procurement policy has reached the goal that it's really multi-level and cross-cutting. And I think those two, when we talk about policy, are those two properties, let's say, are very, very important for something to really make impact. At least this is true for the city of Berlin. And I think it reflects also on the example of the water in Granada, where you have basically, you start with one resource, but you then start to build it up in a really holistic way, in the sense that you identify all the stakeholders, you identify maybe all the economic activities connected to that resource, and then you can start educating people on behavior change, etc., etc. So it really becomes multi-level and cross-cutting. And I think, this is just what I wanted to say here. These two things have proven quite successful here in Berlin, as it seems. So there seems to be a very positive outcome of this policy. And maybe one more point very quickly. I think what both Fedra and Oriana said, the policymakers need to be also aware of what the market does. And I want to again put this, make it very clear with an example. So in wood construction, which is fairly new or fairly popular at the moment, and it is sometimes like this, that there are tenders in the city of Berlin, but there's no answers from anyone because apparently the wood construction sector is so busy and so full that the maximum capacity is reached, but still the building needs to be built because there's usually a timestamp on this, on the public spendings. So that means there needs to happen something. And then what happens is then sometimes, since there's so much demand at the moment for wood construction, it is not possible to find the right companies who can do it. It's not possible to find enough raw materials to do it, and all this then needs to be imported from somewhere else. Totally not favoring a circular approach anymore, and so this is also, I think, the market dynamics and knowing them very well, also from a public policy perspective, is another very key point here.
Absolutely. We have so many more questions that we would like to ask. But one of the things that we wanted to bring up, one of our attendees also wrote in the Q&A. So what specifically is the role of collaboration between cities, of international collaboration between cities in becoming circular? How can international cities learn from each other? Given that all of you are coming from 5 different cities streaming in to join us today, I was wondering if we could talk about that international collaboration specifically between cities. Maybe Jasmine, if you want to begin.
Yes, it sounds like a good question for me. I think it's incredibly important. We realize this time and again when we talk to our members and also other cities, that they want to learn from each other and they want to have a space to share best practices, to share what doesn't work, in particular what doesn't work, in private, and just know how to avoid certain pitfalls. And I want to mention the Circular Cities Declaration again, because it's not just a declaration, but we also, with it, sort of created a room for the signatories to talk to each other. We have webinars for them. We have other ways for them to talk to each other. And whatever we do, not just in the field of circular economy, being able to talk to other cities is one of the key points for them.
Yeah, thank you so much. We talked a lot about European context, about Berlin, Amsterdam, Turku. But actually, I would be, in context of this question, I would be really interested in, like what unique and particular questions concern a city when they want to embark on a circular transition. And here, Piyush, you mentioned your work in different contexts as a Humboldt Fellow, as a German Chancery Fellow. Where do you see like differences between cities, like differences in needs towards a circular transition?
So good, thank you for that question. So like at least there is a huge divide between global north and global south in terms of what is measured and what is managed. With the given current value chains, you could imagine, like every country is very much dependent on another country. So you cannot be, like circular in your own domain without really making an impact on another part of the world as well. So, and this is something that we saw earlier on as well with respect to SDGs, where I think there was a ranking mentioning a lot of global north countries in top scale. But when you start incorporating or factoring in, like where are the inputs coming from different countries and the impact that is being done in the global south, then of course, like the story completely changes. So in fact, even like cities in Germany, like it was very interesting for me to see Germany, as I read earlier, was one of the most circular ideally in terms of waste management cities, but when you go really deep down at a city level or even at a resource level, you'll be surprised to see that even Germany has just 14% of the raw materials that are in fact reused and reused again in that ecosystem, and pretty much everything is dependent on other economies. So Germany, although it's a rich country, but it is fairly poor in terms of resources, so, and that has been the case with with resource rich countries. There has been impact. What I think it's very important to have such platforms like ICLEI, C40 to have that sharing of information between these cities. I really like that idea of twin cities as well, where one city sort of learns from another, and even if there's a city that is managing something better and it's been documented in a proper way, then it helps the other city, even beyond Europe for that matter. So it does not need to be only European cities twinning up, but it needs to be also, so pretty much an Indian economy is also dependent on the German economy and vice versa as well. So why not sort of partner in that sort of level as well, maybe at a city level? So while we have a lot of platforms which are more at national level, like the G20, G7, G8, but not really much is happening at a city level. I could be wrong. Maybe Jasmine would have some cities from Global South as well, and C40, of course, I know there are. But what I need to see is more action also in these platforms. So for example, there are a couple of cities in India which have signed up to the Milan Food Policy Pact. And when I ask my local administrator, what is it that you're doing? And then they're just, signees to it and just waiting for next direction to come in also. So ideally, it just does not need to be centered at one part of the world, whereas the knowledge should be sort of incorporated and should be shared across the globe as well.
Yeah, please feel free to jump in.
I like what Piyush was saying, and I kind of think there's definitely lots of opportunity to learn across different countries, because it's not because you're in a different country that you could not be in the same setting. For example, there's been quite a bit of research on ports and how they can become circular. So there's lessons that can be drawn that are valid for Copenhagen, Malmö, Gothenburg, but also for Alexandria and other places all over the world. So as I mentioned before, we just did a review of the 151 articles that focus on circular cities in the last 10 years. So we will have publication out probably closer towards the summer. But so one of the findings that we have there is that so across the globe, you see studies that look at urban metabolism, material flow analysis, energy, and so measuring the environmental impact of going circular. But then if you look at what else do they look at? So it's in low and middle income countries that they tackle also the social impacts, where they talk about informal workers. And if you were to become circular, it's again very sectoral focused on waste, but they are basically the only studies on social impact are the ones on informal workers in low and middle income countries, which I find a bit of an issue because there's also informal sector workers in Europe, in America. They exist everywhere. So I would say in that percent, it would be good to also look at labor and employment issues within Europe. And if you then think about, so what do the European studies look at? So they talk more about living labs and governance and how you can include different types of stakeholders. But again, those kind of studies should be replicated elsewhere and across the whole globe, because governance issues and ensuring transparency, democracy, and that people have access to the different rights or increase the rights that they had before. So I would definitely advocate for more research and more cross-country collaborations, looking at what works well in one country and maybe seeing whether it's something that you could take up in another country.
Jump in?
Yes, yeah, please do.
Just to say that we believe in the peer learning at the UCD. So everything that we do within this program on the circular economy in cities and regions, it's also related to enhancing collaborations across the cities. So for example, I mentioned the case of Granada. logically, as in order to support the city, we do a specific diagnosis of the challenges in the cities, but we don't do this alone. We always have other cities participating in the case study specifically from other countries, and that are at different levels of advancement towards a circular economy, so that the city, in that case, for example, the city of Granada, can definitely learn from other cities that in some cases can be more advanced. For example, in the public procurement, how did they do? How did they overcome some obstacles? Or at also the same levels of advancement, we want to do a strategy. Where did you start from? So our support is always, let's say, accompanied by specific experiences that cities can exchange to one another. And another thing that we do is to support international networking through a network platform which is called OECD Roundtable on the Circular Economy in Cities and Regions. We gather every 6 months. We were able to do it in presence before the COVID crisis, and now that we will be doing this virtually. Next appointment will be on the 18th and 19th of May. So there are several sessions in which cities can exchange, can brainstorm, can one another, can get information about specific issues, for example, in relation to sectors, strategies, or measurement framework. And this is a good way to link cities, but also practitioners, academics, because you need the vision and also the inspiration from different stakeholders. And we think that this is a very interesting way to put cities in contact to one another.
Peer learning internationally is essential, but I've also been thinking more about how do we just spread awareness and education about circular economy through schools, through policy schools, as we attend HERDI, but also, Georg, I know you're teaching a class on circular design and urban prototyping. Could you elaborate specifically on what this class is and how you're kind of spreading circular economy through diverse sectors of education?
Yeah, sure. But maybe before doing that, I will add another point, which is another example of Berlin. So Circular Berlin, as an association, we were commissioned to do a zero waste strategy for one district in Berlin, Berlin-Kreuzberg. That's maybe 2 years ago now. And what we also did was very much collecting best practices from other cities and from other initiatives. And obviously that was very helpful. But what I want to emphasize is that, and what we also saw in our work after the first phase, was that you need a very clear translation of these actions to your own circumstances. Because, again, this is speaking from my background as urban designer, urban planner. Every city is very different in its properties, in its urban metabolism, in its density, in its activities, economic activities, and so on and so forth. So very important is that we, I think in my point of view, is that a city, and maybe this also applies for the city level, doesn't get confused or too much into a cloud with all these best practices, but rather really tries to make this step towards action and towards trying to understand what those good practices mean for our very own district or city. This is just a point I want to emphasize. This is what we tried to do together with the district here in Berlin, which ended in the catalog of, I think, 15 measures that are now perpetually implemented. Okay, and then I'm teaching at the moment a couple of things. One focus is circular economy and urban prototyping. By urban prototyping, I mean, or we mean that a prototype is always like a first model of something. Okay. or like a prototype of some kind of product. And what we try to do is based on the idea of circular economy. Of course, we have a lot of input on that topic first, but then taking this idea and trying to apply it on an urban level with the topic of energy, water, food, infrastructure, etc. And we invite our students to, because our students also come from all around the world, we invite them to think about one system, let's say the water system in India or in a city in India. And we try to go through with them a couple of steps to analyze the most important components, like stakeholders, like governance structure, like current urban situation, and then to come up with a prototype solution for a more circular dealing with this topic. And that's something that we have done for the last 2 to 3 years. And doing it like this, in this really very step-based approach, has helped a lot and has resulted in very interesting outcomes, because this also allows to see different dimensions of circularity for different material flows or for different sectors. And then maybe one last thing, I'm talking too much here probably. We are currently very much focused on the construction sector, where we try to understand try to promote the concepts of reusing materials, which there is a lot of problems in law to do this, which is a big obstacle, but there's also movement towards allowing for this. And we are trying to understand the potentials of wood construction specifically.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Georg. Maybe we can take another question from the Q&A. Elena asked, what is the least circular aspect of urban policy? Where is there the most room for growth in urban planning and urban governance? When we want to pitch in there?
In terms of least circular aspect of urban policy, I think this could mean any specific issue, whether you want to talk about food or transportation systems in a city or water governance, but the least circular aspect and room for growth. Open to all.
Personally, I would like to hear Oriana tell a little bit more around the OECD experience with the cities that they have, Granada, Valladolid, Umeå, and Groningen, and so on, like what they found to be the biggest challenge.
So, and I will also respond to the question. So, I think here, the point I would like to one is that when we asked to see with these 50 300 stakeholders, 6 case studies in Spain, Netherlands, Sweden, we're now working with United Kingdom, Ireland. So we asked, what is the problem? What is the obstacle that you see towards the transition to the circular economy? Well, the problem is not so much of a technical issue. So all the cities argue that technical solutions exist. The problem is how to put them in place, how to make sure that you have a regulatory framework that allow this transition, how to make sure that funding is enough. So for example, in terms of funding, 73% of cities claim that funding is not sufficient. The transition, and so this means that only small scale, low risk project can actually materialize with terms of not only environmental impact, but also around 70% of cities also claim that there is not a regulatory framework that allows this transition. For example, even the definition of waste is difficult to understand. Georg mentioned wood, but we talked to the constructors and the operators of the building and construction. If I put the wood aside, then the wood is waste. So how can I reuse it? And the regulation is in some countries and in some instances very difficult to understand in terms of material efficient use. And then the third is about the third obstacles is about the culture of circular economy in terms of producers and consumers ready to barriers. There is still not so much understanding of what the impact of circular economy are. And so if we look in terms of capacities, for example, capacity buildings inside the administrations or the municipalities that are working towards the transition, one of the things is that government is working. There is not so much of a approach. But now, in terms of we overcome this, and EPPC will come up with 3 actions that are very important that the cities can, that the city would, let's say, apply in order to enhance this transition. One is that the cities can act as a circular, promoting the circular, raise awareness, raise interest, and make sure lead by example. So if the circular economy principles are not embedded in the action of the cities itself, then it's difficult for the citizen to follow. So this is one of the things. The second is that the city can act as a facilitator of the circular economy in enhancing dialogue. The business sector, citizens, but also across the levels of government, as Gorgo was so the national, the regional, and the local government. And then the city can also act as an enabler of the circular economy, because we need governance conditions to be in place, and in terms of regulation, financing, but also innovation. For example, cities can support the sector, creating incubator, giving spaces for experimentation, or creating a one-stop shop window for business sector to understand where these opportunities for circularity are. And then there is another enabling condition to data and assessment, according to the principles that we cannot improve what cannot be measured. I know that finding data and data, harmonized data and information is very difficult, and at the moment it's challenging because the circular economy is an umbrella concept. So we talk about circular economy, but in reality we talk about how to apply circular to food, to building sector, to water, to waste. And so there are, of course, several measurement frameworks to take into account, but it is very important to have an understanding of where do we want to go, so to establish measure progress and see how far we stand for the achievement of these objectives.
Thank you so much. For our participants, just quickly, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A in the sidebar. And actually, Jasmine, I just wanted to go to you because Oriana was talking about collaboration in the dialogue aspect. And we've talked a lot about C40, Eurocities, and you mentioned the European Circular Cities Declaration earlier. Maybe can you combine it with your answer? How do you foster dialogue between cities so that you can bridge gaps?
And also address the participant's question on the least circular aspect of urban policy, if possible.
Yes, I'm just going to make this two separate parts. So one for the least circular aspect. Honestly, I'm not sure what the numbers say. I think it very much depends also on the city you're in, and we've talked about Turku before, or the others have, and we have done a project, or are still doing it, I think, with Turku called Circular Turku, and where we also help them define the top 5 priority areas in their city on how to become circular. And we have a tool that helps cities assess what areas are most important for their cities to become circular, which I think shows that it differs from city to city. I think we've talked about the building sector. The building sector is very important, but yeah, it varies. So I don't want to make the definite decision on what's the key one. But to interpret this question of, I think, because I just reread it, like where there's the biggest room for growth a little wider, I think one of the biggest problems that we have in cities and outside of cities is that we still don't pay the true cost for the product. And I think that would be one of the key things to change. You know, if products that are sustainable were less expensive than new ones, and whether you do that with taxation or whatever, this is one area. If we were to able to figure this out and change that, we'd come a lot closer to solving this problem. As for your questions on the Circular Cities Declaration, what was that question again?
Basically, we talked a lot about collaborative agreements like C4, like Eurocities.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Actually, so this the declaration, while we and a lot of other stakeholders, so we're not the only ones doing this. We have some great partners in this. Why we decided to do this is because cities were asking for it. So we were working on a project, and there were cities in there who were like, well, we need like a public platform where we can make this statement, that this will help us in our administration. This will be great to like, really enforce our commitment. And so it came from the cities saying, hey, we want this on a European level, because we also didn't feel like it existed. And that's why it was created. And now we launched it in October. A bunch of other cities have joined already. So it allows for people, for cities to make this public commitment. It provides a lot of information, a lot of guidance. And as I said before, we have room in this declaration. So it's not just, a fancy thing where you sign up and then it's gone, but where, you talk to the other signatories, where you learn from each other, where you come up with ideas on what to do next. So yeah, I really want to stress the point that it's not just one thing. Again, you put your name under it and then it never comes back, but it's actually an ongoing process. There's reporting in it. We've talked about reporting. So here it's more qualitative than quantitative, but it's proven to be rather popular with the cities, and we hope we get a lot more now that the word's kind of getting out, like Berlin, for example, who hasn't signed yet.
Absolutely. I hope more cities sign on soon. It's kind of similar to the concept of circular economy. We've kind of talked through like just transitions and environmental justice a little bit here. I was wondering if you could talk more specifically, open to all of you, how we center the most marginalized communities in circular transitions within our cities.
Well, I would really like to hear from Piyush on how to do it in a city as large as Delhi with very different scales. But if I can also tell a little bit quickly on the social impact study that we're doing at the moment. So we've been looking at how circular cities have dealt with the concept of social impact, the impact on people's jobs, for example, on their culture, on their community, on their political system, on health, on rights, and so on. There's a really nice definition from the International Association for Impact Assessment on how you should look at social impact. And so we found that no one looks at it from a holistically. Everyone just looks at jobs and disregards or looks just at participation and political systems, but they disregard the other ones. So I would really love to see something that studies that look at all the impacts. And then I would say, personally, like if you look at just transitions, so it's very important that you look at the effect of policy. And especially, for example, on the circular economy here in Sweden, you don't pay tax if you refurbish your apartments. But so who can refurbish their apartments or their house? It's the one who owns the house and the one who have money to pay for the refurbishment already. So poor people who live in rental accommodations or do not have the funding to refurbish their apartments, they are excluded to benefit from that policy. So that's just one example of how a policy, well-intended, excludes people. So I would call for actually a review of different policies and how they impact on people, and looking at income, access, and so on and so forth. But I'll stop, and I'd like Piyush to to add a little bit on his experience.
Sure, thank you, Fedra. I completely echo the like the challenge that at least in a country like India also we face, because where for the moment the topic around circular economy is focused only towards waste management, and you could imagine in a country in Asia, it's a very informal sector. So a lot of people are dependent on this waste recycling, because we don't have still segregation of waste. So essentially everything is sort of collected, and it's easier because you have so many people who are employed at the end of the pipe, what we could say. Essentially, again, if a regulation comes in which sort of makes it even difficult for such people who are really striving, on a day-to-day basis to even make ends meet. And waste collection, you could imagine, it's very, it's not the best, a job opportunity for any person, let's put it that way. And ideally with automation and, they are the ones who would lose, both in terms of jobs and also in terms of, their, even if they have health insurances and stuff. So it's really to the marginalized. And I could really imagine, of course, in a circular economy transition, there would be winners and losers. My personal, I would say, estimation is that the losers are going to be essentially the people who are really at the bottom of the pyramid, so to say, who are really in the cleaning stuff. It should not be mixed up with just technology is a silver lining bullet that is just going to, or a circular economy is a silver lining bullet that's going to change the world for better. It is a gradual process. It would take years and maybe decades as well to really make things circular, given the current production systems that we have, which has completely mixed up biological and technical cycles. You could imagine it's only commodities like plastics, which have some value attached to it, that then goes back into a system which is also then downcycled. But apparently with any other commodity, I think it's really difficult for the moment to really to segregate it as well. And hence we are with this landfills and people who can just sort of take these plastics, who are making some able to generate some employment to it, while we also at the same time we see a good movement around these startups which are really on the ground. They want to make lives better for people, whether you call it circular or smart or IoT, but the main crux is it's people centric. And if you move away from people, if you move away from the society as a whole, I think that becomes very challenging as well. So you could imagine, India currently imports the largest amount of plastics, given the China ban. At the same time, with textiles also, we have shoddy. Most of the textiles from UK is shipped to India, and then it's physically dismantled and then repackaged in a way that is given again to say like a charity aid or relief web and given as a relief material. But again, it's very manual and definitely not technical for the moment.
Yeah,
To add onto that, Piyush, I just want to say also, it will be important in the transition to also look at the gender aspect, because I think at the moment a lot of women do the undervalued manual jobs, and the moment that there's money to be made, women get shoved out of the job. So I would say, while we look at the transition to circular economy, let's not forget the whole gender aspect as well.
For sure.
Oriana, you also would like to say something?
Yeah, I agree that there won't be a circular economy. There won't be. So this includes the migrants, and this includes women, and this includes so all these categories of say unheard stakeholders, because we always think about stakeholders that play an important role, business sector, fine, but what about the others that makes choices? But I also believe that the circular economy, if we think about the circular economy as a way to reduce waste and make sure that resources are used as much as possible, well, in the future, this can benefit also those of people that might not have that might not belong to the wealthy categories, let's say, in terms of income per capita. For example, the circular economy foresee the shift from ownership to services. So think about the fact that in a city, you in the future you own things that share and use as services. So even, for example, in the case, one option that could be a large number of people. Eco-design would imply that if somebody buy any kind of furniture or appliances, these are supposed to last longer. So they're not supposed to be a price after only a few years because of the planned obsolescence. There is also an aspect in terms of reusing and repairing to make sure that products and goods that we own can last long. And this also has an impact in terms of jobs, because circular economy is more labor intensive than mining. And so all these jobs also may require specific skills development, but for example, they don't education level. So we can combine and we can make sure that skills at educational level can also create jobs within a circular economy approach. So I think there are positive aspects to look at if we think of how the circular economy is intended as a shift, as a system. So project, but if we think in a system shift, bring in lower income population.
Thank you so much for all those answers. So we have time for one last question, and it's our most upvoted question in the chat. Georg, I saw your hand, so we can go to you first. But I would also like to add on to this question a little bit myself. So the question is there a scalability issue with circular urban policies? Do they require a certain critical mass of population or critical mass of economic activity to be implemented? And I also just wanted all of your thoughts on if you could make one specific change in the city that you live in tomorrow, what would that one change be policy-wise? So Georg, if you want to start us off, please go for it. I know I just asked a big question.
That's a very big question. And I also wanted to say something about the other question, but maybe that's not very important. I think from the perspective now, and I'm also looking at this transformation to circular economy quite critically, and it's also one of my starting points of my PhD thesis. But I think from that perspective, what I would wish for, then I would wish for an increased participation of civil society in policymaking, and not just participation in the sense that they can maybe vote on something in an internet poll, but really significant and meaningful participation at maybe a district level. So this, I think, is maybe a more general wish, but could specifically, I think, push the circular economy agenda.
Thank you so much. The others, can you briefly also answer Ellie's question?
I can also repeat the question if needed.
So one aspect you would like to, if you could change that by tomorrow in the city you currently live in?
And scalability, if you would like to address it.
If I can go, if I can reply, scalability, I think is definitely a very important point. Just to mention one of the results of this report I mentioned on the circular economy in cities and regions, 84% of cities that we interviewed, they use a pilot and experimentation to initiate the
means that pilot and experimentation can happen
at different, and sometimes they are very small. For example, can be a neighborhood that's experimenting a specific type of separate waste collection, and maybe using also smart technologies, or some experimentation are done at campus and university level, which, by the way, they might have the size of a small cities. And so in order to have a better understanding of what the impact could be, for example, reusing recycled material for construction, or using demolition material for building roads, for example. So all this is done at a specific scale that is supposed to bring some impact, but the next step will be to scale them up. This is one thing. In terms of critical mass, this is another issue. For example, I mentioned sharing in terms of transport, and we know that in several cities we have electrical bikes or vehicles. It could be cars, it could be motorbikes. Of course, you need a certain demand for this kind of services. There are many small cities, like, for example, below 100,000 inhabitants, whereby you don't have this demand, and so the investment is not just possible, not only in terms of investment and maintaining cost. So this is something to be taken into account. But beyond, for example, in this case, the sharing platform that allow us to think that the collaborative economy, it is part of the circular economy. We also have to rethink the way we use spaces, we use parking, we use the cities in general. So there is a relation between transport and urban planning that we need to take into account. Principles that we said at the beginning of thinking holistically and systemically. So my wish is related to this, is related to make sure that there are connections. If, for example, the cities is planning long-term strategies in terms of tourism, I need to see what happens in terms of food waste. And in some cities, there is no even organic food waste collection. And if I collect the food waste and I where this product is going, probably fertilizer, and then I need to increase the linkages between urban and rural areas. And so, which is, if it is a fertilizer and I can increase the local production, then this local production can go back to cities. So what I would like to see is this sort of loops across sectors, across people, and across places, in order to just and making sure that these dots can be connected, because this can bring advantages from an environmental point of view, but again, can create jobs, can create a economy. The circular economy is an economic first. So let's connect the dots across the actors that are part of this economic system, locally speaking in cities, but then having an impact.
Thank you, Aria. Let's maybe, if our participants still have like 3 minutes, let's quickly give everyone the chance to give a final answer. Fedra, also, thank you so much for the resources you posted in the chat. Maybe you want to go ahead, and then Jasmine and Piyush.
Yeah, so for me, it was the one solution I would like to see implemented in the city would be a car-free city center, building upon a little bit what they do in the city of Paris. So globally, 24% of the emissions come from transport, and 72% of those emissions are from the road. So this also entails trucks and buses and all kinds of other things. But if we were to make it private vehicle free, for example, imagine all the space you would have to build parks, more greenery and so on, better cycle lanes, make the city safer. Your car is parked, I would say, on average 23 hours of a day, and it depreciates really quickly. So I would say going through a circular vehicle system where you share cars instead of owning them, I would say for me this would be the nicest thing. Also because I live in the city and we don't need a car, we can walk or cycle everywhere, and there's great public transport where we are. So I would highly recommend that.
Should I go next? I wanted to say the same. Thanks. I'm a little unlucky that you went first. But then I'll rephrase it a little bit because we're starting a lot of initiatives for in Berlin. I'm located in Berlin for super blocks, sort of similar to the way they are in Barcelona. And so instead of car-free city centers, I'm just gonna wish for more super blocks in Berlin. And just one thing in terms of the critical mass, I think when we think of like really small cities or villages or whatever, we need to not forget the rural-urban linkages. So, yes, maybe by themselves, it would be hard to become circular, but they're not detached from the rest of the world. And if you see them in connection again with their surroundings, with close, bigger cities, it is again possible. And we also work with smaller cities that do things in that regard. Yeah.
Okay, Piyush, you have the last word.
Sure. Oh, that's a tough one. So what I could, just say is I think there are tons of best practice across the globe. Now we have had enough of them. Now it's time and decade of action. What I could just definitely say is during the COVID crisis, what we now really understand is, like that the city administrators really are overburdened and they have a lot to do, and they understand the city better than any other national government, at least in our part of the world. So it is very important to really have like a vision now for a city in the next 10 years. And this is where the participatory approach comes in. So ideally, if we can have could be anything, like it needs to be circular, or needs to be focused on transport or on urban agriculture or on pollution or whatever that is, but it needs to have a vision and then work towards that vision in next 10 years or so and give that a thought, rather than thinking in terms of 3 or 5 years and the state government changes, then the central government changes, then the city government changes, and on top of that the global so you find another person ruling another part of the world. So ideally we are all going to stay in those cities, and God knows how long this current scenario is going to last. So essentially, if we have a vision and then work towards for next 10 years, then that is pretty much it.
Thank you all for all of your answers. And I'm so happy you brought up transportation as well, because that was one of the themes we didn't get to today. There's so much to discuss and unpack in circular cities, and we're so grateful for all of you for the perspectives and insights over the last 90 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. And I believe the main stage for the close of the European Public Policy Conference is coming up. Thank you again for your time and insights.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.